Hello, this is Andy Friedland. In about 9 minutes, we are going to start with our ENVX live office hour on July 1st, 2015. Looking forward to seeing you. Hello, this is the ENVX live office hour. We will start in about 5 minutes. Looking forward to seeing you then.
Welcome to the second ENVX live office hour on July 1st, and it happens to be Canada Day, so we'd like to say a special welcome to our Canadian students. I'm Mike Goudzwaard.
I'm Andy Friedland, instructor in the course.
And to get started, we'd like to remind you how you can add your questions during this live office hour. So there's several ways you can do that. You can comment in the Google Hangout or use the discussion forum in the live office hour tab on the edX course, and a number of you have added questions there already. You can also submit a question by Twitter, use the tag #ENVX, or on the Facebook page. So we look forward to seeing some of your questions coming in during this live office hour. We'd like to start with a question about increasing albedo. I want to know if there are changes that can slow the positive feedback of global warming. Small changes, such as increasing the albedo by painting the roofs of buildings white. And that comes from Ana Maria in Ecuador.
Well, thanks for that question. It's a great question. And yes, the answer is you can change the albedo. So remember, albedo is the percent reflectivity of surfaces on the Earth. And so there is a movement in some countries to make more rooftops lighter colors. Not necessarily it has to be white, but a lighter color will increase the reflectivity of the rays of the sun and decrease the absorption, which on a global scale, if enough colors changed, it would actually have an impact on the Earth energy balance. This comes into play when you have snow melting and snowfields melting and become darker in color. And that's an example of one of the positive feedbacks. When warming leads to less snow cover, you can then get more absorption, which might lead to more melting. So those are the kinds of things that we have talked about in the course. And that is a great question and a great applied environmental science question. We're talking about rooftops and how we manipulate them. The other thing I'll bring up, and I don't know if this is space fantasy or space reality, but people have talked about the feasibility of putting large mirrors in space to reflect incoming radiation and reducing the amount of incoming solar radiation reaching the Earth. So thanks for that question, and there's a lot more that we could talk about in that general area, but those are some of the basics.
Great. Our next question comes from Ravinder 1972. Environmental health. What will the effect be of a changing environment on the health of future generations?
This is a topic that people talk about a lot, and there's a number of review articles that cover the possibilities. I'm not sure how much there is that's widely agreed upon peer-reviewed science, but there's the thinking that as temperatures become warmer and as habitats change, as climate changes within certain habitats, that there might be a greater expansion of certain organisms that might be pests or might be human parasites. So people talk about the possibility that the range of mosquitoes might change, and that would lead to more malaria, for example. There are other things such as ticks that maybe aren't being killed off in certain winters because the temperatures don't get as cold during the winters as they used to. And that might allow the range of that tick to expand. And if that tick transmits a disease to human beings, that might affect future generations or perhaps present generations. So I'm less certain and feel less confident talking about specific studies because I think while there are individual studies, there doesn't seem to yet be a consensus. But in theory, one would predict that with a changing global environment, which is warmer in some areas, wetter in certain areas, that yes, we will see an impact on health. Then there's a whole nother area, which is just the physical temperature. So we're looking at large numbers of deaths this summer in India. There was a few summers back in France and other places in Europe. There have been times in the United States or other places in North America where summer heat waves have led to larger numbers of particularly older people and people susceptible to high temperatures dying early. And so the question is, can you say those weather events are specifically related to climate change? And that's something that more and more people are starting to do. But again, there's not a wide consensus that an individual heat wave in a given summer is definitely part of the global climate changes that we're seeing?
Great, a great question, and the theme of the 6th week of the course, which we just opened on Monday. So there are some readings and video in the 6th week that also address some of those topics. Walter227 actually sent in a couple of questions. Here's one about other major problems. Other than topics related to climate change, what do you see are the major problems in human interaction with the environment? I'm thinking of things like habitat destruction, overfishing, pollution, but not CO2, etc.
Well, thanks. That's a very important question. Sometimes you might think that we focus too much on climate change or to the exclusion of other topics. And probably what you picked as the first possibility, habitat destruction and habitat alteration, is absolutely another major problem that's going on, or another human-caused environmental interaction. So we're talking about taking native habitat, whatever it might be, prairie or grassland or forest, and altering it in some way. It could be paving it over and turning it into a road or a parking lot, but it could also be just removing the vegetation. And depending on where you are in the world, you end up with perhaps erosion and soil loss, and then you've lost nutrients, and then you've lost stored carbon in the soil. When you remove vegetation, there's carbon and other nutrients in that vegetation that might be lost from the ecosystem. So probably that habitat alteration, which leads to physical parameters and chemical parameters being changed, and then also the organisms that depend on that habitat are perhaps at a disadvantage. So you might see reductions in numbers of certain species. So you bring up overfishing, and we could also add hunting as direct ways that human beings are reducing the numbers of individuals in certain populations. But you can also have habitat change, which indirectly reduces the viabilities of populations. So those are, I would say, some of the major problems in human interactions with the environment. And thanks for asking.
Great. The next question is population versus inefficiency. And this is a topic that comes up often in the course. I've read that more and more forest needs to be cleared to produce enough food to feed the growing human population. I have also read that 40% of all food that is produced is wasted. Do you think overpopulation is a major problem, or is the inefficiencies in our daily systems?
Thanks for the question. I think it doesn't have to be either or. We could argue that there are too many people that are eating higher on the food chain than the earth can sustain, and there's too much food waste. So absolutely, I've read that same number, and I've seen studies say between 35 and 40% of food that shows up on the plate in the United States is wasted. I haven't seen as many numbers from elsewhere in the world, and I know there are a lot of societies where no food or very little food is wasted. But there certainly does seem to be a fair bit of food waste, and that number 40% is in a way analogous to what we said, or actually some of you are just seeing the weeks 4 and 5, where we're talking about one of the ways to reduce your use of energy is to increase efficiency. So rather than the need to generate more electricity, generate less electricity, but do the same work by using lighting or using machinery more efficiently. So one could extend that to food and say, absolutely, we could reduce the demand for more land and reduce forest clearing by reducing the demand for food. So that's absolutely one part of it. But on another level, absolutely, with more people, you need more food. And with more people eating higher on the food chain, that is eating food that requires a higher energy subsidy, you're requiring more land, you're requiring more energy, you're ending up with more carbon dioxide emissions. So they're all collected, and they're all connected. And I guess I would say that it's probably both are contributing, as well as with some other factors. Thanks.
Here's another question about efficiency. Where did the sound go? So in the case of the turbine, the steam is passed over the turbine, which generates electricity used for running electrical appliances, along with byproduct sound. Since matter can neither be created nor destroyed, where did the sound energy go?
So this question is referring to the power plant tour that Mike, help me out. I think it's in week 4, right?
Yes,
so
week 4.
Week 4, the power plant tour, and you notice at one point in the video, we're in a very loud turbine room. And I make the point that some of the energy in the oil that was converted to steam, that turns the turbine, that turns the generator and makes electricity, some of that energy is converted to sound. And that sound energy dissipates to the environment. It's lost to the surrounding environment. And it's part of that example of, or it's part of an example of entropy, that randomness is always increasing. So this very non-random, concentrated fossil fuel energy ultimately is converted to sound, and that dissipates to the environment. So it would be very hard to make use of that energy. I suppose it's theoretically possible to somehow convert sound energy to something more usable, but for the most part, it's just lost to the surrounding universe as increasing randomness. So thanks. Entropy questions are great, and looking at energy and transformations of energy to usable work are great questions. So that's a short answer to that question.
All right, next we're going to see a few visual discussion posts and a couple notes on posting images in the discussion forum. We really encourage you to do this, particularly in week 3, a favorite meal, where you described a favorite meal, shared a photo, and tried to calculate the energy subsidy for those calories you're consuming. You'll notice that in edX, we now have the visual discussion tool. In each week, right after the weekly welcome, there's a tab that's visual discussion, and there you can see all the photos from the discussion that week. And then if you click on the image, it'll take you to the discussion thread. So that can be a helpful way to find some of those visual discussions, because they can get a little buried in the discussion threads on edX. So this first one is bacon and eggs, and that looks tasty. Bacon and eggs. At home, we like to have bacon and eggs. We eat it a lot. We eat a lot of eggs, likely twice a week. But the bacon and eggs meal is likely once every 2 weeks. I looked online for a chart of energy subsidies for different foods and came across this paper, Energy Use in the U.S. Food System. It was written in 1974. I'd estimate the eggs have an energy subsidy of 2 to 1, and the bacon likely around 10 to 1. And that's from Dwayne Nicole.
Well, thanks for that question. Adrian, do you mind going backwards to that photograph? I have to make a full disclosure here. That's my picture of my favorite weekend breakfast. So I'm a lot like Dwayne Nicole, sorry, I don't know. That's to me a good, now my apologies to people who are vegetarians, my apologies to people that don't eat pork, all kinds of apologies going out. But I wanted to show you this picture because I had to walk about, less than 100 meters to harvest those 2 eggs, because we have chickens in our backyard. And that bacon came from a farm less than 20 miles or 35 kilometers from my home. And the strawberries are from the next town over from where I live. So only those blackberries, which came from Florida and were probably transported by train, are coming. Oh, and the coffee, of course, the coffee came from somewhere far away. But I wanted to point out that we're all doing this. We're all looking at our food. We're all talking about where our food is coming from. So to answer this question, or to respond to the question, that energy use in the U.S. food system, 1974, is a great study, and it was by Steinhardt and Steinhardt. It is by Steinhardt and Steinhardt. It was published in Science. You can definitely find it if you just type that title into any search engine. And it was probably, as far as I'm aware, the first paper in modern science that tried to understand where the energy subsidy comes from. So Dwayne Nicole wrote that he or she guessed that the eggs have an energy subsidy of 2 to 1. And that's probably a little low unless your eggs are truly in your own backyard. I would guess eggs might be a little higher, 3 or 4 to 1, depending on how they were raised and how much energy subsidy went into them. And bacon, that number sounds a little high to me. If you look at some of the current studies, and remember that pork is a more energy efficient form of meat than, say, beef. Beef is the highest one, and beef might be 10-1. And I wasn't able to find the bacon or pork in the Steinhardt and Steinhardt paper, but I'm guessing that bacon is more likely on the order of 5-1 or 6-1. But at any rate, the approximations that you're making are right on target, and it was so good. Mike and I both have really enjoyed seeing your favorite meal contributions and the various things that people are weighing in on. And we have a couple of more questions about your favorite meals. So we should probably move on to the next one. Sorry to take so much time on that one. Obviously, it's an important topic to me.
Right. So let's look at this next meal, which is served on a leaf. That looks tasty. And it was posted by Dr. Vilas. Curry and rice. The cooked rice, curry, and a variety of side dishes, see the picture that we just looked, of traditional sadhya, or banquet, served in Karela, and my apologies if I'm not getting the pronunciation right, during festivities is my favorite food. Organic content of this food is just about 1%. Energy subsidy of this food is around 2 calories.
So I didn't know if that was Dr. Vilas or Dr. We weren't sure, but I had a question. I didn't know why the organic content of this food is just 1%. So were you saying that it was really minimal, or most of it was commercially raised? It just struck me as interesting. I wasn't sure how to interpret that 1%. But the energy subsidies of this food, saying is around 2 calories for every 1 calorie, looked like it could be appropriate if there wasn't any additional energy used, for example, for heating in a greenhouse, and it was growing in the open environment, and if there wasn't an additional energy used for irrigation. I didn't know what to make of it, though, if it's only 1% organic or organic-like. If there's some commercial fertilizers, if there's any commercial pesticides, I would think that would contribute to a higher energy subsidy. So I can't really answer this. You can't always look at a food and say, but certainly if it's mostly vegetables and grains, you could argue it's 2 or 3. It's certainly low in terms of its energy subsidy. And then you can't say how much in the way of commercial processes were used in growing a particular food when you're seeing the end product. So great post, and really great to see the picture, and I'm afraid we can't fully answer the questions or confirm the numbers that are used, but they look like they're fairly approximate and probably reasonable. Maybe just tweak them a little bit.
Great. So we have one more meal, and just a reminder that you can post your questions. We have room to take a few more questions, so just go ahead and post them now. Here's a meal from Venezuela, and it looks like there's plantain and avocado, probably some rice and egg, black beans, and Henriola says, a dish from Venezuela. This is a typical dish of Venezuela, high calorie and balanced in animal protein, grains, and fruit, such as fried plantains called slices. And maybe we can go back to the plate image there too. So it's great to see these different meals from around the world, and it does look like a fairly balanced meal.
So Mike and I thought we'd put this one in because we don't have a lot of information about whether or not there was commercial processes going on, whether or not there were added fertilizers or added pesticides, for example, to the fields. But we can say that with the exception of the animal protein, which it's hard to identify from the photograph exactly what it is, but let's assume maybe that it's beef or pork, that the vegetable material on that plate and the egg are probably low energy subsidies. So you could guess, you could approximate that we're talking about 2 or 3 or 4 calories of energy subsidy for each calorie of food that you've obtained from it. And then we're a little less sure about the animal protein, exactly what that is and how much of an energy subsidy that might require. But if you haven't done that favorite meal in week 3, we wanted to put in these questions that people had raised and include the photographs to maybe give you a little encouragement, and you can still go and do that. And you don't have to send us a picture, although we like to see the pictures. We also like to see what you're saying about them. So feel free, and if anybody has one that they want to send in right now, we are still taking a few questions. So that that's what we'll say about, I think that's our last food slide.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah. We also wanted to mention some additional readings and resources. So at the top of the course tab, you can see all of the additional readings and resources listed, and particularly for the food miles. And we have a article, Food Miles and the Relative Climate Impacts of Food Choices in the United States by Webern and Matthews, and that's from 2008, published in Environmental Science and Technology.
And Mike, I think you and I have talked about why we included this. This is a fairly recent article that has really changed people's perceptions. In many countries in the world, people for a while started focusing on how far their food was transported. And this paper by Webern and Matthews demonstrates that the transportation in many foods is not a large part of the energy subsidy. The largest parts of the energy subsidy for most foods is what was used in the food production process, what was used to grow it, how much energy was used to perhaps heat a greenhouse, how much energy was used for fertilizers and pesticides, how much energy was used for irrigation. And that transportation, not for all foods, but for many foods, is a small part of that story. So there's all kinds of reasons, as we've talked about in the course, for eating locally, but it's not necessarily that eating food that comes from far away is going to drastically change the energy subsidy. So if you haven't taken a look at that outside reading, it's definitely worth looking at, and I'm sure it will inform your impressions and your discussions about this subject.
Great. And Andy, you have a book here for us, I think.
Yeah,
right? Should we hold that up for the camera?
Yep, and the reference is on the next slide, but here's the actual book. It's called The Boy Who Harnessed the Wind, and there we go. Get my fingers out of the way if I can. The Boy Who Harnessed the Wind by William Kamkwamba, who's from Malawi. And full disclosure, William was an undergraduate at Dartmouth and was one of my students, and he graduated just a little over a year ago. And in this story, which is a wonderful, true story, it's authored by William Kamkwamba and Brian Mueller. And in this story, William, in Malawi, his family was having hard times and couldn't pay the school tax. In Malawi, like a number of countries around the world, you actually have to pay a fee to go to public school. And so William couldn't go to school, and he spent his time in a library, in a public library, and he browsed through books. He couldn't go to school, but he still really loved learning. And he picked up a book on energy, and he learned about windmills and wind turbines. And using old automobile parts and junk from a junkyard and old bicycle parts, William built a wind turbine. And at first, people thought he was crazy. They thought he was possessed by perhaps spirits, or they didn't know what was wrong with him, so they thought. But in actuality, he was building a wind turbine. And at first, people were very skeptical, but ultimately, William built a wind turbine that generated electricity, and there was a light bulb at the top of his tower, and people came in this area of Malawi where there was no electrical infrastructure. There were no lights on the horizon, no lights in the sky, and people came from miles to see this light that was shining in the dark, totally generated by wind energy. Ultimately, William started charging people to charge their cell phones from this electricity, and ultimately he ended up with a lot more electricity for a school so people could study, and it's a great story. And then, as I told you, he came to the United States and received a bachelor's degree from Dartmouth. So it's The Boy Who Harnessed the Wind by William Kamkwamba and Brian Mueller, and it's a great book to read.
Great. So someone wrote in with a question or a comment about the Venezuelan meal. And that comes from Daniel Felipe Martinez Gamboa. And Daniel says that Venezuelan dish is very similar to a Colombian one. Of course, you need to have in count that is a dish, I think he's referring to the high calorie count, and became popular with the workers. They work a lot all day and didn't exactly have a balanced food because they need, I think, a lot of the calories. So
okay,
yeah,
thanks.
yeah.
Thanks for that post. That's great to know.
Yeah. So yeah, common to other parts of the South America as well. We have another question here. Let's see. With the recent G7 summits, the droughts in California, Brazil, and Africa, and all the forest fires in Alaska, there is a major focus on climate change. Yesterday, Brazil and the USA signed a deal to produce 20% of their energy through renewable sources. So talking about some of the global political events related to renewable energy.
Thanks for that post. I wasn't aware about that treaty, so I don't know any details of that treaty, but you could just say in general that if we can generate more of our electricity in this case, or it says produce 20% of their energy through renewable sources. So I don't know if it's for electricity or it's liquid fuels, but absolutely moving more towards renewables is extremely important. And another distinction that we make in weeks 4 and 5 and actually extends into week 6, so maybe you haven't gotten there yet, but we can talk about whether or not it's carbon-free energy sources. So remember that there are biofuels, which involve carbon, but it's modern carbon as opposed to fossil carbon. And then you also have electricity generated by wind or by water or by the sun that are almost carbon-free, except for a small amount of fossil fuel energy to manufacture and install these systems. These are almost carbon-free. And so those are some distinctions. And yes, a lot of countries around the world are starting to generate more and more of their electricity and energy, such as liquid fuels, from carbon-free sources. And that's a very important distinction to make. Thanks.
Great. Here's a quick question about forest fires and CO2. How do forest fires affect CO2 emissions? So it sounds like this question is about the carbon cycle from Trox64.
Okay, so great question, and it's an important one. A forest fire is a natural event. So we have to assume that long before people were setting fires deliberately and accidentally, there were plenty of fires. But what a fire does is take stored carbon on the surface of the ground and very quickly move it into the atmosphere. So the rate of transfer of CO2 from dead organic material to the atmosphere is rapid. And so forest fires, while you could argue that it's vegetation, it's modern carbon, it's not fossil carbon, it's not like burning coal or oil or natural gas. Nevertheless, forest fires do, at least in the short term, increase CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere. Depending on where this forest fire occurs, and assuming that the land is left alone, eventually that land that is burned will revegetate and remove that carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and take it in as carbon dioxide and incorporate it in its plant tissue in photosynthesis. However, that may take years to decades, and depending on the forest, maybe even centuries until all that carbon is removed from the atmosphere. So if we're looking at a carbon dioxide problem in the atmosphere that's on the order of years to decades, this is something, large numbers of forest fires is a problem. It absolutely impacts CO2 emissions, and it contributes to increasing concentrations of CO2 in the atmosphere.
Okay, great. Let's see, we do have a second question from Hashavana Sadhana about countries adapting to prevent climate change. The world is adapting green technology, but not at a pace quick enough to prevent catastrophic climate change. What do you think is holding countries back? That's a tough question and a complicated one, because countries are complex systems. I know our Rosie Kerr, our sustainability director here at Dartmouth, talks about changes that can happen on our campus. So our campus is a much smaller system than a country, but those systems like heating that are controlled centrally, you have less people that need to have input on those decisions. Whereas if it's an individual decision like turning off a light or turning off a computer, that requires many more people to be involved with that kind of change.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. So what is holding people back? What is holding countries back? Infrastructure, like you're referring to, is one. personal actions. These start to push out and away from environmental science and are more in environmental studies and environmental behavior. But there's the fear. Certain countries don't want to take measures that might add to the cost of doing business, particularly when they view other countries as not having to incur those same costs. There's all kinds of things. Maybe there's just infrastructure. What Mike brought up is just so much what you're set in a certain way, and why should you do it differently? However, there's an argument going on in the United States right now about coal control technologies, the emissions control technologies for coal, and how expensive they are. So people are already spending money for one thing, and the argument is, why not just look at another technology? But maybe the questioner is asking about the pace, and why isn't this moving fast enough? And it probably then goes right back to inertia in existing infrastructures. It's just so easy to keep doing what we're doing. And that discussion that Mike referred to is the interview with Rosie Kerr, the sustainability director, which is in week 4 of the course. If you haven't seen it yet, you might see an elaboration on that question there.
Yeah, great. So there's another question about energy subsidy, bio versus local. And I'm not sure how these two terms are defined. Maybe we'll figure this out in the question. I live in Bangladesh. Is the energy subsidy larger when eating local food with all the industrial agriculture, or eating imported certified bio products? So it sounds like the locally grown options are industrial agriculture, and then maybe organic is imported.
Yeah, that's what it sounds like to me, and that's a tough question to answer. So we are not familiar with that certified bio label, but it sounds like it must be, excuse me, sustainable or organic or something like that. And so it very well could be that eating imported certified food, remember what I said about maybe transportation doesn't add that much to the energy subsidy of a food item, but I'd want to know, how far away is that food coming from? And that's a very tough question to answer. There's something to be said for buying local, because it supports your local economy, and maybe you're supporting people that you know or people that live near you. So that's important. And maybe by buying certified bio food products, you'd put some pressure on local growers and maybe encourage local growers to grow food in a bio-certified or similar to a bio-certified way. So there's a lot here that we would need to know more information to fully answer the question. But I sympathize with you if you're trying to make that decision, because that's a tough decision.
Yeah. We have another question about food choices and their impact on the environment. This comes from Michael Brown. How does eating vegan or without meat products impact the environment? Is it really a substantial way of improving your impact on the environment? And I think this goes directly to the prompted discussion in week 3, where we asked people to calculate the food subsidy. And of course, the lower on the food chain you eat, the less subsidy goes into producing that food.
Absolutely. So maybe that's a blanket statement you could make. The lower you eat on the food chain, that is lower on the trophic period. So if you're eating all vegetables and not even things that came through animals in any way, such as dairy or eggs, I would say you probably are having the least environmental impact. Maybe there's some qualifications one would have to make about growing large amounts of grain or seeds, but that's probably a fair statement. You can see I'm being careful here, and I'm thinking, how is that? Where could one object to that? But probably now, of course, nobody's telling you to do that. A lot of people say that they need to eat different things. But if you were a vegan or you were a vegetarian, I think you would probably have a lower impact on the environment than if you're eating meat or you're eating dairy products. That's probably a fair statement to say.
Yeah. Great. We have a couple more questions coming in, but while we're waiting for those, I'll just say that we've had a lot of people helping us with this live office hour. So we're in the Innovation Studio at the Jones Media Center. We thank them for their help. Mike Murray, who's running the camera, Adrian Gauthier, who's video switching, and Chloe Madel, one of our TAs, and Adam Nemiroff, who are helping with the questions and the social stream, and Joby Bernstein is one of our TAs as well. So I'm just going to check about, so there's a question about fertilizers and pesticides. I'd like to know how farmers and industrials calculate the amounts that are needed to apply over crops, and how would governments regulate this? So how much fertilizer? I mean, that's really a farming question. I'm not a farmer, so I don't know that I could answer that. Do you,
so general principles, without talking about specifically, is that a farmer will try to identify if their fields are deficient in any of the plant essential nutrients. So if they are deficient, then that particular fertilizer would be added. Often fertilizers, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, NPK are their chemical symbols, are what's added. So you might have a 10-10-10 NPK, 10% nitrogen, 10% phosphorus, 10% potassium fertilizer applied to a field. So Mike's right, neither of us are in the practice of going out and making those recommendations and making those determinations, but that's what's done in theory. But the question is, you know, could there be regulations so that there isn't too much lost from the fields? Well, first of all, if a farmer is paying for their fertilizers, they don't want to put on any more than they have to. But there is the potential for contamination of nearby waterways if too much is put on. And that can be an organic fertilizer, that can be cow manure. It doesn't have to be a chemically synthesized fertilizer, but too much applied to the fields or applied right before a heavy rain. Right here in the Northeast, we've been getting lots of rains this week, and so someone who applied fertilizer earlier in the week would look at a lot of it running off as opposed to infiltrating and staying with the soil. So those are all challenges that one would experience. I hope that helps a little bit. We didn't give you specific answers, but I hope that helps.
Well, great. It's been really encouraging to see all these questions come in during this live office hour. We're a little over a half an hour, and that was our plan to spend about a half an hour taking your questions. Thank you very much for everyone who joined us. And for any of you who are watching this as a recording, feel free to post a question in the discussion forums if something comes up, or if you have another comment related to something in this live office hour. So thank you. Do you have any?
Thanks for joining us.